Hi, everybody. I'm Margo. I go by Margo. And last time I was here, if anybody remembers, I don't expect you to, but I had different footwear. So I just had ankle surgery a few weeks prior, and I was in a boot. And it was like talking about goals. My goal was like get on the stage at TINYpulse or TinyCon and get up there in my boot. So today I have some different footwear. I'm kind of excited about that. So just showing it off. Anyway, I am really, really happy to be with you today. And I'm also feeling like, I don't know if you're feeling like this, but my brain is so full. And my heart is so full already. And I'm like, how do I go up there and talk about anything after everyone's been talking about so many interesting things? I'm like, ah! I'm going to do my best. And I also need to grab a clicker. So I'll do that too. But what do I want to talk about? So where I actually wanted to start was just talking a little bit about Howard, because I actually worked at Starbucks. But I was like, a regional training manager, I think, when I first met Howard. And Howard was like, I don't know, the president of like everything. It certainly felt like that to me. And I remember I went to something that was called Coffee, Culture, and Connections. It was called the 3 C's. And so you'd actually go to Seattle. I was based in Chicago, and you'd get to have like this amazing experience, this amazing training, and you'd hear from all the leaders of the company. And Howard came in, and he actually had a baseball bat when he came in, and I was like wide-eyed, like what is going on? And he told a story, which was that it was given to him by this really tough real estate developer in Chicago, Sam Zell. And Sam and him were in like these really tough negotiations, and Sam sent him the bat and said, like, don't be afraid to play hardball. And Howard brought that into the room and said to all of us, like newly hired employees, like, don't be afraid. What he just talked about today in terms of like turning your fear into faith. And I realized this as I was thinking about today and being with Howard, that has like never left me. Just that feeling of what he said here, don't be afraid to be fired, and that's what he said. And I was sort of like, it was a constellation above me, but like, I know things were fiery with Howard and Howard, right? And I know that he took that conviction, and they both took that conviction into their interactions. And I think about it on myself on the regular. And so what is it about that story that really, really gets me in the heart is that we in the workplace have the opportunity to really transform people's lives. And that's also what Howard was really talking about in terms of the different hats that we're wearing, which is you shouldn't actually have to have a different hat or be a different person. We talk about authenticity. It's definitely become a buzzword, but that's actually what it is. Like, we could handle work a lot of different ways. We could have it transactional. You get paid, you do this, you go home. But why should we care about that? We talk a lot about engagement. It's that work is developmental, it's transformational. And if I think of my own work and my own life, I've had the opportunity to change as a human being because of the experiences I've had in the incredible companies that I've actually been a part of. So I'm going to just move on to talk about some of those companies. And I was talking about this with Howard before we started. I'm like, I've had like a good run. And I don't know that I can claim any credit for it. So I was at Starbucks for 15 years. Then I actually got super brave and decided to go lead HR because I was like, you need to put your money where your mouth is. Because I was super critical of different things. And be like, I'd do it differently. So I decided you better put your money where your mouth is. And so I went to Lulu, and I became the head of people at Lulu. But when I think about those two companies and the indelible impression that they actually really made on me, is that like the first thing that comes to mind when I think about Starbucks. At Starbucks, I actually spent like at least a month in a store when I started as a regional training manager. So I literally was a barista for like over a month. And I actually, coincidentally, I became a barista when we introduced Frappuccino. So I would literally go home, and it wasn't like it was today. I would go home with like Frappuccino mix on my shoes. I remember this. I wasn't that good at making the Frappuccinos. And my dogs would like lick my shoes every day. I was very popular with my dogs. But what did I learn? And I was cashier. And I realized in that moment a couple things that were so indelible for me personally, but also about the Starbucks culture. One, I was often the first person that somebody would talk to that day. And that's what I learned from Howard, and I learned from that company, that like I may in fact be the first person and maybe the only person that a person interacts with as a barista or as a cashier at Starbucks. The other thing I learned is like Starbucks was never bigger than the frontline barista. And that's something that I've taken with me over the course of my whole career. Every company I've worked at has frontline workers and people who are the closest to the client, and no company can ever be bigger than those employees. And I'm super adamant about that, super passionate, and there shouldn't be two cultures for the different types of employees that you have. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So that was Starbucks. What did I really get personally from Lululemon? Lululemon has a practice, and some of you may know this, and this is a little bit similar to what Howard talked about with the 5-year plan, of actually teaching every employee how to write a vision for their life and to set goals. And those goals are not exclusively about work. They're actually like things about your life. And often the goals are about leaving the company. So to Robert's point, how can we actually embrace the goals that our employees have that may actually exist outside of the realm of the company and not be afraid to say goodbye? And that's something I think that there's so many topics to talk about. That's another thing about retention strategies. I think there's a belief of like, oh, we want to keep people forever, and we want to do all these things. You know what? It may be amazing and perfect for their life to go do something somewhere else or to start a business and to clap people out on their way out like they do at Apple. That was something I learned at Starbucks that really has impacted me as a human being over the course of my whole life in terms of really checking in to see, am I aligned with my vision and goals? And over the last year, I've had to make some really tough personal decisions when I realized that I was actually out of alignment with my personal vision. And so I can just really see that impact of how you can reach in and have work be a very transformational place. So I want to talk a little bit about culture. One of the things that's, I think, tempting and dangerous about going to a conference that is as amazing as TinyCon is that we hear a lot of things from other companies. So we heard Howard talk about Starbucks. You heard me talk about Starbucks and Lululemon. You're going to hear me talk about Stitch Fix. There's a temptation of going like, oh, I'm just going to go back and just like do that. I'm going to implement the employee transition program. I'm not going to do performance. We're going to get rid of performance reviews. Everybody's going to wear one hat. It's going to be amazing, right? And you go back and everybody's like, what the hell happened to this person at the conference, right? And it's something that I feel super, super I'm so bullish on it because I've had the opportunity to transition to 3 incredible companies. And every time I've had to check in with myself to say, what's correct for the company that I'm in right now? So it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to Lululemon, taking everything from Starbucks. Oh, going to Stitch Fix, good. Oh, we're going to just lift and shift from Lulu and just have everybody writing vision and goals. That's what everybody's going to do day one, right? It's very, very tempting to do those things. And yet, I stand before you today sitting listening to Howard, I'm like, wow, there are so many seeds of what I learned from Howard and learned at Starbucks that have influenced me and the people strategies that I've employed across all the companies that I've worked for. So my message here is the first bullet, which is personalize it. Really think about what's the DNA of your own company and really create and take the seeds, take the inspiration and apply what's really correct for you. Be really explicit and deliberate about your culture is another element that I think is what Howard talked about, is like your actions have to line up to your words. Your decisions, your principles, your practices have to line up with what you say your culture is. If there's a dissonance, it's just so interesting with what Robert said is, well, you can't do this unless you have a foundation of trust, right? And so, boy, that is an alignment between this process that they have about transitions with what the actual culture is in the company that he's working in. So those are just like 3 general tips about creating culture. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Stitch Fix, and we're going to talk about high growth. So Stitch Fix was the first private company that I ever worked for. So when I left Lululemon, it had been a very tumultuous year. It had been the year of the see-through yoga pants. It was a year where there was a real lack of alignment. It's funny on the outside, but let me tell you, it's not funny on the inside about those pants. And I love, that's the other thing I want to say too as I talk for the rest of this time. I love all the companies that I've been with. I have nothing but love. And even though I'm going to talk about the shadow side of some of these cultures, because I think it's important to do that and to do that with your own company. But anyway, I knew that I was going to leave. Our CEO was leaving Lulu. I made the decision to leave as well. And interestingly, sidebar, that was one of the most productive periods of my time at Lulu when I knew I was leaving, because if I had any trace of fear, it was gone, because I knew I was going. And so, I kind of remind myself every day, like, just think of yourself as if you're already fired. And what is that like to operate in a company when you're already fired, you know? So you don't play tight. But anyway, sidebar. So I had a team of 90 people when I was at Lululemon. When I moved to Stitch Fix, it was like me and 3 other people. And I was like recruiting coordinator, compensation analyst, I don't know, I was everything. And I was super freaked out, even though it was what I wanted. At that time at Stitch Fix, there were like 50 people in our headquarters, and we had 100 stylists. And we had 1 warehouse, and I think we maybe had 100 people in the warehouse. Today, we actually have over 5,000 people in the company, 3,900 stylists who are actual full-time employees. We actually have 4 warehouses. And we have about 800 people in our office. So that's been, and we actually were private, we're now public. Our revenues when I started were like not quite single digit, you know, but they were small. And today we're, you know, like, I think if you follow Stitch Fix, you know our results. Like we've been a very successful growth company and continue to do that. We started out, when I started, we had a women's business. Now we actually have a women's business, a men's business, and a kids business. So suffice to say, there was a lot of change. So when I look back on this, and I just kind of wanted to share with you, like, well, what are some things I've learned about high growth? Because that was a newer experience for me. Lulu went from 200 million to 4 billion, or 400 million to 2 billion when I was there. Starbucks was still at high growth, but this was really a different situation. And so I wanted to share with you some thoughts about that. In terms of what I've learned. So this is what we call our Stitch Fix OS, which is our operating system. So we're very, very deliberate about codifying what the culture was at Stitch Fix and what we stood for. And I think that, you know, when we kind of look at, and I think the blurb that Tyler helped me put together is just there are a lot of companies around, and particularly in the tech space, and particularly in Silicon Valley, where we've seen the cost of not being deliberate about what the culture is. Because the culture sort of just happened, right? And then it became something that like, wow, that's actually not what we really intended it to be. Or maybe it was sort of like we did intended it to be that way, it was actually wrong. Or it was, you know, some manifestation of a CEO who maybe wasn't fully developed as a leader. Like there are all kinds of reasons these things happen in cultures. And you know, this is maybe going to sound scary, but I feel like we're all a couple of incidents away from being, you know, on a newspaper headline. Like that's kind of what I remind myself every day. And I've had great friends, good people who are in companies where bad things happen. I've been in companies where bad things happen. And so I think we have to approach all of these conversations with a sense of hubris and our own humility. And that's why I want to talk about the shadow side of culture in a couple slides. So anyway. But this is the OS, and we were very deliberate about saying, who do we hire for? What are the values? And this is really what our practice is every day. And then, what is leadership? How do we actually create a future at Stitch Fix? And this is like, we just sort of like really are like, this is what we always come back to. This is what we come back to. And so 4.5 years later, when I look at what am I really proud of, I'm really proud of the fact that one of our TINYpulse questions is actually about, I work with a group of kind, bright, and goal-oriented people. I can be my authentic self here. And that score is upwards in the 90% for us and continues to be with all of that growth. So I'm super proud that we haven't succumbed to, you know, as Howard was kind of talking about, a bureaucratic place, a rule place in some ways. In a healthy way, we have boundaries, we have rules for sure. But I'm really happy that people feel like they can be fully expressed, because how can you have innovation if you're actually not fully expressed? Does anybody here use Stitch Fix? Does anybody play Style Shuffle, which is like the little thing? I'm addicted to Style Shuffle. Do you love it too? Because I think there's a group of people that are just like, it's a thing where you can rate clothing like super fast with a thumbs up, and that it actually helps you get a better fix. But anyway, there's a person on the algorithm team who created that, and he was, you know, he wrote a note to myself and to his leader and said, I don't think I could have created this any place other than Stitch Fix, because of the partnership that I have with the cross-functional teams I work with, and actually the innovation. I mean, and he's a data scientist, so he has lots of opportunities. That's a hot market, and he has lots of opportunities in terms of places he could work. So there you just see, like as an example, the way that innovation, his ability to be authentically himself, to really drives the retention and really creates the culture and is kind of like that flywheel that keeps it going. And actually, wow, cool things for our customers. And that's really what we're all here. It's that symbiotic nature between the employee experience and the customer experience that we have. So those are some things that I would say I'm very, very proud of over the course of the year, of the 4.5 years. I think the other thing too, and I don't, it's kind of something I think we should inject in the conversation, is we talk a lot about the role of the HR team or the role of the CEO. One of the things that I have come to learn over the course of my career, and that we really were very much implementing at Stitch Fix, is that we all generate the culture. So don't go like, oh, I'm going to the culture department to talk about the culture issue. It's like, who, right? Okay, now I hear you guys all go, yeah, all right, okay. We can applaud about that, right? Because we generate it. Who makes the choice? Who decides to be the brilliant jerk? It's not the culture department. It's that individual. And so cultures are made by all of those micro minutes, micro interactions with each other that we have that ladder up to create a culture. This is just one, just a small example of just something that we've also done, just the way to embed the culture is to really talk about like what are management principles. So one of the things we'll talk about on the next slide is just, that you really want to have your culture, your framework really lining up with actually how you do things, to how you exit people, to how you pay people, to how you manage people. So we were very, very explicit, and this is just kind of an example of us saying, like, we actually created management principles because we realized this was like probably in year 2 that I was there. We have all these people getting promoted to managers, and people are coming from other places, and people don't manage people the same way. And so we had to get very, very clear and very explicit about what the manager principles were at Stitch Fix. So this is just a little example of that. So in terms of what are some of the things that I've seen over the course of my career that really actually help drive strong cultures during high growth? The first one is an aligned leadership team is essential. So Howard talked about that being like so critical and that it starts at the top. It does, and it actually starts around the table at the top. So one of the reasons I joined Stitch Fix was because Katrina Lake, who's the CEO and founder, had an incredible set of values. Like, I knew that the minute I met her, and our values were aligned. I met the leadership team, values aligned. Who wants to be the people person who's fighting for the agenda? I saw that in some of the comments on the Slido. Like, how can I ever get these people to, I'm being more dramatic. Maybe that's my style. But anyway, how could I ever get these people to align on this? Or because there's just like no way. I mean, who wants to be the person who's constantly pushing uphill? I don't want to work in that company. And trust me, there were lots of places I interviewed that were like that. And I was like, I don't want to be, we need to turn the culture around. It's like, like Howard said, if it's not that person who wants to turn it around, like, I'm not going to be able to turn that around, as much as my ego might want me to believe that. So the aligned leadership team. One of the things we do at Stitch Fix is all of our leaders teach our classes. So the HR team doesn't teach the classes unless it's our turn. So Leadership Day, which we do, is taught by like Mike, our COO. I teach it, I take a turn. Eric, who's our chief algorithm officer, he takes a turn too. We all take it, and we all love it. And we all complain about it too. Like, we all definitely go like, oh God, it's coming up my calendar. It's a whole day, how am I gonna do it? And then after we're done, we always send each other the same note, I'm so glad I got to do it. I feel rehired. And that's one of the things that we talk about a lot is like, how can we create that experience? It's one of our manager principles is to rehire each other and to rehire ourselves. When you're in high growth, you have to repeat, 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 and never get tired. And that is probably the same as when you're not in high growth. And I remember when I was at Lululemon, our CFO talked about that being the experience of going public, where he said I had to keep telling Lululemon's story like over and over and over again. Every time I had to make it new. And that's what you're going to be talking. You're going to be talking about the OS. You're going to be talking about your values. You're going to be talking about being authentic or whatever your culture is. You just can't get tired. And you will. You will. I mean, I have days where I'm just like, I can't. I just can't. And it's like there's going to be somebody, if you've got the right team around you, who's going to be able to lift you up. Call me. I'll lift you up if you have that day. Seriously. Okay. Consistent in philosophy, yet personalized in application. So I'll challenge Howard a little bit on this. It's like there's some things I really like to be consistent. Like, I don't like it in companies where they say, oh, well, we have this for our headquarters, our philosophy, and then, well, we do that for like warehouses or people who work in the stores. Like, it gets me going, because why? Why would you have a different set of values? Why do you, at the highest level of your culture philosophy, why would it be different? Now, what's different is how it gets personalized. You know, we have a philosophy at Stitch Fix about market-based pay. And we do that in our warehouses. We do that in our headquarters. And then how do we do that? Like the frequency we do that or how we benchmark it is different based on location. Org structure. We have principles. We want jobs that are meaningful and big for people. But we actually don't prescribe. We all have to have the same levels. We have one organization that has a lot of layers because that works for them. We have another organization that's very flat because that works for them. But we hang together with the principles. And so that's something that just feels to me that is just an important thing to consider. Hire to it and fire to it. I feel like I should modify the fire to it, maybe transition to it. I'm inspired by what Robert said. But you gotta do it because there are known secrets in companies where it's like, oh, that person's just going around, doing this, and nobody's doing anything about it. The known secrets are damaging. And especially in the top leadership roles, people who aren't either skill set fit or cultural enhanced or cultural aligned. I don't like to necessarily say culture fit because I feel like that can actually become weaponized and it can actually inhibit diversity and inclusion. So culturally aligned, people can do a lot of damage and it can last a really long time. And I think you can do it respectfully, you can coach people for sure, but you actually have to be super rigorous about it and you actually have to hire to it. I was polling one of my colleagues who I said, I'm giving a talk about culture, like, what do you think we've done well? What do you think we haven't done well? And he said, we don't tolerate brilliant assholes, which is a Silicon Valley thing. And trust me, it's very tempting, to say this is a 10x person. This person contributes 10x to anybody else. But you know what? They're not in partnership. That is ultimately going to hurt us. And those are very, very tough decisions to make. I've made those decisions. I love smart people. I made them at Starbucks. I remember there's one person on my team who was like, oh, he's so smart, and then it was just like, he is just not working out. And I really had to come to terms with that myself. Know when to hold and when to fold. This is one I feel like I'm right in the middle of, which is, when is it time to shift a philosophy? When has the time come? So this one is a friend and neighbor to repeat, never get tired. Because it's like, well, when do I actually need to go maybe this isn't working anymore? And so those are things that, we're kind of looking at our comp philosophy. I don't think it'll change a lot, but we're like, how do we actually evolve this? Is it actually working, or do the philosophies now work together in our current environment? So Eric, who's my colleague, also talks about it and calls it opening the vault. Where you sort of need to open the vault every 6 months and look at all the principles that you have and really ask yourself okay, are these things still working? And not be afraid to do that and not be afraid to ask TINYpulse questions about it, get feedback about it, and listen. This last one to me is the most important one, which is creating the future versus a default future. So I learned this from one of my teachers, Suzanne Conrad, who's an amazing leadership development leader. And there's a lot of default futures in companies, which is, well, now that we're public, it has to be like this. Or now that we're big, it has to be slow. Or now that we're, there's no way we could do. Fill in the blank for yourself, right? And so this is one for me that I've challenged myself to be I'm not falling into it. Why does it actually have to be that way? How can I be a harsh realist, but also not just allow some future to take hold that isn't actually my future? I believe in the possibility that Stitch Fix could have twice as many employees and still have an incredible culture. So what do I have to do? But if I already kind of start out with this kind of inner voice that's saying, well, it's just going to get big, all the companies get big, and that's just going to happen. I'm feisty, and I know you're feisty, and you wouldn't let that happen. So this is related to the 5-year plan, which is own your plan. Don't let someone else have your future be your destiny. Yeah, okay, I feel like I want to stop. I feel like I want you to yell. I don't know. I feel like I'm preaching. But anyway, I love you guys. Okay, but wait. This is what I want to do. I don't know. I brought my iPad. I don't know how I can do this, but and we only have about 11 minutes left. But I want you to interact. And even if you don't do it in Slido, or just do it in your thing, what do you think is great about your culture? Just write it in there, where we would write a question. Just share it with each other. I want you to just be woo, we're good. Just take a minute and do that, whether it's in Slido or whether it's on your paper. Just write down what's good. I just want to record that. Because we're going to the dark side next. And I want you to hold the light. Right, David? Okay. Okay, so I'm not an expert on Carl Jung, but I'm intrigued by Carl Jung because he's very interesting. He likes astrology. I like astrology. That's another talk. But he's very interested in the full person. And full people have shadow sides and they have bright sides. So for example, I am passionate and like challenging in a good way and creative problem solving, and I'd like to think when people spend time with me, they'd be inspired and they'd want to solve problems. I'm also intense. And so there are times when whatever it is, when I get tired or when I get stressed or I overuse that, I'm intense and probably not that much fun for my team to be around, right? And so I have to own both of those to be able to say, wow, a strength of mine that's overused can actually become a development for me. Now, we've said this a couple of times, and I so believe this. Companies are like people. They have their own thing. Like, they start out with the founder, but then just with the inputs of all the people that work there and everything, they become their own entity. And they're like people. And because they're like people, they too have shadow sides to them. And this is like, I'm going to reiterate, I love all the companies that I've worked with. But they all have a shadow side, and it's all related to what's the bright, beautiful side of the culture. So Starbucks, and Steve talked about this, incredible like mission and values, mission statements, and these may have changed over time, but there was one that was beautiful, and it said, we treat people with respect and dignity. I was like, it's awesome. Well, what sort of happened, and I saw this because I was an HR manager, and I worked a lot with the stores when I first started, and people would say, when you'd give feedback about performance, that's not very respectful. I don't feel like you're treating me with dignity. And it would be like, wait a minute, I'm just giving you some feedback. And so what that created, like something that's really amazing, created a little bit of a culture that was harder to performance manage and to be very direct. Because it could be kind of like a little bit of a glitch of like, how can I be respectful and dignified with people, but yet tell the truth? So that was a little bit of the Starbucks shadow side. And what does it lead to? It can lead to people being, hanging around for a long time. Or people having conversations they should have. It happens like meetings after the meeting, right? Where people are like, whoa, this, really didn't agree with that, but I'm gonna, And look, this can happen. This is a really good company. With Lululemon was, talked about the vision and goals, a culture of intense positivity. Like with a mission statement of elevating the world from mediocrity to greatness. Wow, I can get on board with that, right? And yet, there was a suppression in talking about things that weren't good, right? So if you wanted to be like, you could say like, I think the fabric isn't right, or something like that, right? It was hard for people because it would be like, well, that's not being very positive, And so again, it could be that positivity where it starts to play against you. With Stitch Fix, there's a really interesting one. So you may have noticed that one of our values is actually partnership. So Stitch Fix is like the pinnacle of all the places I've ever worked where cross-functional work is intense and important and amazing. Because we have like data scientists and stylists who work together to deliver the client experience. We have merchants and data scientists. We have, engineers and styling, and we have all these different combinations of people, and it's beautiful because we always, talk about the sum is greater than the whole of its parts. Like we really genuinely believe that we're better together. Dark side of that, shadow side, is that it can inhibit people from taking a leadership role and saying, I'm the one who has the decision here. Because it's that kind of weird feeling of like, well, we're all solving a problem, but then sometimes it could feel like, well, no one's really solving the problem. Or we're all solving it, who's responsible to make sure it gets solved, right? And that's something that we're being really explicit about. And so I'll talk a little bit about it in terms of what you want to do with the shadow side. But, so, for fun, what is the shadow side of your culture? Come on, you have it. So you can go in Slido, you can go on your paper, and you can write something. But it's really good to know it. This is the sweaty part, but it can be fun. You might also write down what's your shadow side, too, to have it be extra fun and sweaty. I shared one of mine. Okay. So what do you do about it? The first thing is to be willing to see the shadow side and talk openly about it. And so, I think like the happiness metric and talking about people being happy is great. I also love what Howard said about, like, what did he say? It should be you want a fulfilled life or a complete life and not necessarily like expecting it to be happy, because it's going to be complex, it's going to be challenging, it's going to have growth, and growth is not always like happy. Like, growth can be super hard. Think of a butterfly. How does a caterpillar become a butterfly? It liquefies itself and eats itself. That is not pretty, right? But like, that is how growth can be, and that's how looking at the shadow side can be. Is like, there's an amazing outcome, but you have to be willing to look at it, and you have to be willing to create an environment where people can actually talk about it, right? And that's where things like TINYpulse. I mean, I've been able to learn a lot about the shadow side, and also the amazing things about Stitch Fix 2 through TINYpulse. Like being able to read people's comments, and it's even subtle, where people aren't like saying it, but it's like, I'm starting to hear a theme of this thing, that's coming up that maybe isn't so great. And wow, I wouldn't maybe never otherwise know it. And then be able to talk about it, like as a leadership team, to say, like, here's what I'm seeing. Are you seeing this? And then, because it's a little bit sweaty for people to bring those forward, even in the most open culture, I think. Because it's human nature. We want to be liked and don't necessarily want to be the ones who are like, hey, look, over there, it's a shadow. Okay, the second one is just look at really creating active strategies to strengthen what's working and to shift the shadow tendencies. So one of the things that we've been doing with this thing about decision making is we actually created another survey that we call the Ways of Working survey, so that we could actually like kind of monitor and check in, like, okay, how are these things how is partnership? Do we overuse it? Are we underusing it? Like actually being able to really measure it. That's kind of the third piece. But the second one is related to that. So what we've decided to do is we've got some Ways of Working principles. So we're sharing principles with people because we have principles for everything because we love principles. And then we're actually giving people a toolkit. So here's some toolkits about how to have decision-making be better and still preserve partnership. So what are you going to do to actually just shift it? But the first thing is just to see it, whether it's in ourselves or whether it's in the companies that we're working in. Okay, that's the shadow side. So here's the last part, which is I was a very reluctant HR professional. Trying to think of the word for it. I resisted it. I went to school because I thought I was going to be a university professor. I loved books. I wanted to teach in a university. I got a master's degree, and I realized I couldn't handle being in a university. Didn't really like it. It didn't feel dynamic enough to me. I stumbled around for a while. I found a company I was passionate about called The Body Shop. And I found that I loved training and development. I loved it. Like, I could put together that love of learning, my interest in people, and my love of consumers and consumer brands into something that really made sense for me. And I remember then when I was at Starbucks, I had an amazing leader in Chicago, and she was like, I really think you could have a career in HR, you could be an HR director. And I was like, I want no part of that. Like, it is firing people, it's scary, it's laws, it's restriction. I want nothing to do with this. And she was like, are you crazy? You have not seen the light, And even, I will say though, my HR manager job was hard, because I dealt with like hourly employee issues. I love the hourly employees, but it would be constant like dress code, and somebody wrote something crazy on the chalkboard at Starbucks, and I was just like, I can't do this anymore, And parents calling me to say they're going to sue us, and I was like, I remember the first time I got that call. If you're an HR person, I was crying. Fortunately, Starbucks had an amazing legal team, and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to get sued. Just like, that's not going to happen. But thank God for all the great people around us. But anyway, gradually I came around. And I came around because I began to believe that it could be something different than I had known it to be, and I believe that you all believe that too. And look, you may not have this in your job title, you may have something else, you may be a CEO, you may be whatever. But at the end of the day, I look to the HR profession to really lead the way on many of these things. You are not solely responsible. But I wrote on my note cards as I was practicing for this, preach to the HR people, because I love you. And you have challenging jobs, and often don't get respect. So I want to give you your proper respect and your due, and I want to challenge you a little bit, which is, I have seen over the course of my career this, like, we're a service organization. We provide a service to the company. And I love the servant leadership, don't get me wrong, we should all be servant leaders. But this element is kind of like puts people in a little bit of a lower place. Like, we're actually not at the strategy level, we're more serving and receiving. No, you're a functional expert, and I want to just say, like, I'm standing here before you and honoring you and say, own your expertise. Like, you know this, like, better than anyone else, and I believe in you to do that. Add to know to your job description. That's what I did. Which is like, and my CEO said that to me, she's like, one of the things I love is that you actually like know, not in a weird gossipy, like the dark side of HR way, but like, no, like here's what's going on. Here's what I see, whether that's through metrics or TINYpulse or through conversations, like to be able to say, like, I know what's going on, I have a pulse in the organization. Build confidence in your teams to share what they see. That is something on my own team that I've seen is we have like an epidemic of lack of confidence, especially when they're talking to business leaders. Where it's, kind of like, well, I feel like I don't know if I can do it. And it's not always, it's generated in ourselves, right? It's not the other person, it's our own confidence. There may be external things that happen, but let's build each other's confidence to be able to be hardy and to be challenging and to talk like Howard talks. Maybe not as much swearing if you don't do that, but to tell it like it is, and to be that leader. What was that? It's good to swear. You don't know how much I swear. Dude, HR people swear more than any people I've ever been around. And I am all for swearing. I love sports, and sports is swearing too. But anyway, we'll talk about that's another talk. But anyway, the last piece is, there's just this other thing that kind of like makes me crazy. So this is my slide of like the things that make me go like, that I just want to talk to somebody about, which is, this thing about like, oh, we have to be employee advocates, and like, then that's a business decision over there. It's like, no, it's all the same. We're trying to like do great things for people, whether it's our employees or it's our customers. And so, like, I just like to say, like, anchor your decisions around your culture, your values, your strategy, and let's not pit, like, employees versus business versus customers. Like, find a way to have it be holistic. And I just feel like that's the way to go, and it just makes everything so much easier. It just makes things more data-driven. It makes things more objective. So, anyway, that's all I have for you. I think our time is up. But thank you so much for listening and for allowing me to share.
Wow.
Go get it. Go get it like the storm.
Yeah, so one of my takeaways is we got to swear a little bit more, right?
Look, what the hell? Why not?
All right, so with Slido, we've got some great questions coming through.
I love questions.
So please vote, but one is, how much time, Margo, do you spend on making the Stitch Fix OS stick? How can I make a program that employees don't roll their eyes like, quote, this is just another HR one-sheeter?
Oh, God, that's so good. That's so good. Well, yeah, I mean, it has to be generated from the people, too. And so there's something, I think there's a lot in what Howard said about like that only the truth sounds like the truth, or when things feel authentic and when things feel genuine. I don't know. I mean, in terms of how much time I spend, I think a lot of other people are spending their time. And so to me, that really goes back to what I said about generating it and having it feel honest and being able to talk about it in honest and real ways. And not to weaponize it either. So I kind of talked about that a little bit in shadow. It's like the way to kill it is to weaponize it. To use the culture as like just a bludgeon for people. Like, you don't ever want that to happen. But we do a lot. We talk about it like day one. Boot camp, we have it embedded in all of our programs. We have, the way it doesn't sound like an HR pager is that I'm not teaching it. Someone else is. So Mike is, who's our COO. Like, Mike talks about it all the time. He was interviewed in Business of Fashion about it. So I don't have to. And I think that's what makes it feel like it's not just like an HR program.
Great.
Yeah.
So one that's been popping up on the charts is, how do you interview for cultural alignment, especially for leadership team?
Yeah, the same we would do with anybody else. I mean, we actually have our values, and then we've designed key questions to actually assess if somebody is aligned to those values. I think, again, getting back to this kind of like culture fit, I think it's dangerous not to have something that's very explicit. So I actually love very explicit things. I have Saturn and Capricorn as an astrology reference. So I love very explicit things. Like, you should know, if you're saying you're hiring for partnership, how are you going to assess for partnership? You better know, because you can't have someone being like, I don't know, I just don't feel like David was, very nice.
So is there one specific question that you really like when it comes to personalized for the Stitch Fix culture?
One of the questions I love is, what do you think you would have to unlearn here to be successful? That's one of my most favorite questions, and it works on a lot of different levels. It works on self-awareness, humility. Also, you know, especially depending on where someone's coming from, it really gets to the partnership, because we talk about at Stitch Fix, no one team is king. So if somebody's used to being in an organization where it's like sales runs the world, you know, so if somebody has the self-awareness to be able to say, you know, I think I'm going to have to really get used to the fact that data science is as important as merchandising, or I'm going to have to learn about data. That's going to be really important, or I'm going to have to unlearn this other thing.
Well, that's a great tip. And what was one example from Starbucks and Lululemon that you personalized to fix into the Stitch Fix culture?
It's funny, you know, nothing explicit, but I realized it when Howard said it today, which is one thing is this concept of one hat. So Katrina Lake, who's my CEO, she loved Howard's book, and Howard actually came to Stitch Fix very early on when I was there. But I realized it's the concept of one hat, which is actually the definition of authenticity, which we talk a lot about at Stitch Fix, which is you don't have to change yourself. So that would be one thing I would say. And then from Lululemon, I think it's this concept, well, I think the concept of principles. Chip Wilson, who is the founder of Lululemon, wrote down every operating principle for Lululemon, because he was frustrated at a certain point and really wanted in a genuine way for people to understand why Lululemon did the things that it did. And that's everything from design to culture. And I love that. And we did it. Like, that's something we did at Stitch Fix. They're not the same principles. But it's like, well, somebody needs to write it down so we would actually know. So people would know, and especially when you're growing. So that would be the other one.
Great.
Yeah.
So we'll probably have time for a couple more. I love this one. For high growth, how do you get folks aligned at each phase of growth? And how do you handle it when folks aren't right for the next phase?
Oh, so what's the first part?
For high growth, how do you get folks aligned at each phase of the growth?
Yeah.
And then how do you handle it when the folks aren't right for the next phase?
The first part is kind of funny because I don't think you actually know what phase you're in when you're in it. I mean, isn't that like life where you can, I feel like that's how I am in my life, where I'm like, I only understand the thing that happened when I'm actually like a year in. I'll be like, oh, that's what was that phase. So I think you have to just be in it, you know, and I think you have to align around what your goals are, what your objectives are, what you're working on. I think that's how you align people to what's happening like now. And then how do you handle that with people who aren't ready for the next phase of growth? I think you need to be really honest and open and explicit. I think you need to coach, and I think you need to be willing to transition people. Yeah, I don't think it does anybody any favors to have people hanging around, not for them or for other people. I think it's just this concept, again, it ties in, I think, a lot with what Robert was saying, is just for me, is like a lifelong life or a lifelong time at a company is not like, why? You know, and I've seen so many people who reached a point of not being successful in one place who've gone on to be like super successful in another place. There may be people who want to be in a scrappy high growth, you know, when you get to do like 10 jobs and they don't want to just do 2 jobs, you know. And so I think it's okay, and having them feel like that's okay. And not try to bend the company to like make that work. I think that's also a dangerous thing. Yeah.
So last question.
David's like, is she ever going to stop talking?
No, that's great. Last question.
Yeah.
As we change our culture, we can hire to it. Do you have any advice on what to do with the long-term entrenched resistors?
The resistors.
The resistance.
Oh. So yeah, changing culture, as Howard said, is challenging. You know, I mean, I think that's one that you have to really think about. But I think, what do you do with the resistors? I think you just have to be really honest with them. I hate to give a boring answer, but I just think it might be even saying, like, my experience of you as you're resisting this cultural change. Like, what's going on? Like, what's up? You know, and find out. People will always give you great information when you ask them questions, I find. And so there's an insight there. So it could be like, I think it's BS, or I don't like it. Okay, good, you don't like it. Let's figure out, you know, how to get you to a different place. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Margo Wheeler. Margo.